I'm 74 years old, and I control every single dollar my daughter-in-law thought she'd inherit when my son died. She has no idea. My name is Virginia Caldwell, and 8 months ago, I buried my only child. Nathan was 48 when a semi-truck took him from me on Interstate 25. For 48 years, I'd been his mother. For the last 12. Since my husband James passed, Nathan had been my entire world. And in the 2 weeks following his funeral, while my daughter-in-law Diane sobbed dramatically for the cameras and wore black like a costume, I sat in a lawyer's office and learned that my son had seen something I'd missed. He'd changed his will 6 months before he died. Left me everything. The house in Aspen worth nearly $900,000, 2 cars, and something I never expected: complete control over Diane's $3.2 million trust fund. My brilliant boy had made me the trustee, the one person standing between his widow and the money she'd been counting on. For 8 months, I've watched her, studied her, let her think I was just the grieving old mother, confused and helpless and broken. I played the part she expected: the elderly woman too lost in grief to understand finances, too trusting to see betrayal. But I've lived 74 years on this earth. I've buried a husband, raised a son who became one of Denver's top corporate attorneys. I've seen people at their best and their absolute worst, and I learned a long time ago that the biggest mistake anyone can make is underestimating a woman just because she's counted more birthdays than they have. Diane made that mistake. What I discovered about my daughter-in-law, of who she really was, behind that pretty face and those crocodile tears, that explained everything about why Nathan protected me, why he gave me the power, why he knew, even before that truck took him, that I'd need to be the one holding the keys to her future. This is the story of how my son saved me from beyond the grave. How a 74-year-old widow outsmarted a woman half her age who thought she could play me for a fool. It's about trust and betrayal, about mothers and sons, and about the kind of justice that only comes when you've lived long enough to know exactly how to use it. If you want to know how a grandmother brought down the woman who betrayed her son, subscribe to this channel. Because this story is just beginning, and by the end, you'll understand why age isn't weakness, it's the sharpest weapon you can have. Let me take you back to the day my world shattered, and show you how I built something stronger from the pieces. The funeral was on a Tuesday, cold March morning in Denver, the kind that makes your bones ache no matter how many layers you wear. At 74, I feel cold differently than I used. It settles deeper, stays longer. I stood at my son's grave in my black coat, the one James was buried in his favorite tie next to 12 years ago, and I watched my daughter-in-law perform. That's the only word for it: performance. Diane wore a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Designer sunglasses hid her eyes. Even though the sun wasn't out, she clutched a tissue in one hand and leaned on her friend Monica for support, her shoulders shaking with sobs that somehow never quite messed up her makeup. I'd seen real grief. I'd lived it when James died. I was living it right then, feeling like someone had carved out my insides with a dull knife. Real grief is ugly. It's snot and swollen eyes and forgetting to brush your hair for 3 days. Diane's grief looked like a magazine photo shoot. I pushed the thought away. Shame on me, I told myself. The woman just lost her husband, my son. Nathan had loved her. He must have seen something in her that I was missing. Maybe I was just being the critical mother-in-law, the old woman who thinks no one is good enough for her boy. I'd promised myself when Nathan got married that I wouldn't be that person, but 74 years of living teaches you to trust your gut, and mine was screaming. After the service, people came back to Nathan's house, the beautiful 4-bedroom in Boulder with the mountain views he'd been so proud of. Diane played hostess, accepting condolences with trembling hands and sad smiles. I sat in the corner, accepting hugs from people who told me how sorry they were, how Nathan was so young, how tragic it all was. Words that meant nothing, and everything. I watched Diane. I couldn't help it. She moved through the room like she was already measuring it, calculating it. When she thought no one was looking, her eyes would go sharp, focused. The grieving widow would disappear for just a second, replaced by something else, something assessing. At one point, she pulled aside Nathan's colleague from the firm, a man named Richard. I was close enough to hear her asking about Nathan's cases, his client list, his pending deals. Richard looked uncomfortable, told her those were confidential matters that the firm would handle. Diane smiled sweetly and said she just wanted to make sure Nathan's legacy was protected. but I'd heard the edge underneath. She wasn't asking about legacy, she was asking about money. The first real crack came 3 days later. Diane called me. Her voice was different on the phone, less theatrical, more businesslike. She told me she needed to go through Nathan's papers, organize his affairs. She asked if I knew where he kept his important documents, his will, his financial statements. I told her truthfully that I didn't know, that Nathan handled his own business, and I was just his mother, not involved in those things. There was a pause. Then she said something that made my blood run cold in a way that had nothing to do with March weather. She told me she hoped Nathan had been smart about his estate planning, that it would be terrible if things got complicated, if anyone tried to contest what was rightfully hers as his widow. She said it would be especially sad if family members and, she emphasized that word, family tried to make claims on what Nathan had built. She said she knew I was grieving, but she wanted to make sure I understood that as Nathan's wife, she had certain rights, legal rights that couldn't be challenged. The way she said it, like a warning wrapped in sympathy, like she was preparing me for a fight. I played the confused old woman, told her I didn't understand legal things, that whatever Nathan wanted would be fine with me, that I just wanted to remember my son in peace. I could almost hear her relax on the other end of the line. She softened her voice, told me she was glad I was being reasonable, that she'd take care of everything and I shouldn't worry my head about complicated matters. After I hung up, I sat in my small condo one-bedroom I'd moved to after James died because I didn't need the big house anymore, and I felt something shift. That wasn't grief talking. That wasn't a widow worried about her future. That was someone who expected a fight and was trying to intimidate potential opposition before it even started. Why would Diane think anyone would contest Nathan's will unless she knew there was something to contest? The next day, I got a call from Stuart Brennan. He'd been Nathan's lawyer, our family attorney for 25 years. He'd helped James with our wills, guided Nathan through law school applications, had dinner at our house countless times. When Stuart asked if I could come to his office alone, not to mention it to anyone, especially not Diane, I felt my heart start to pound. I'd thought I was imagining things, creating problems because I was old and grief-stricken, and maybe a little bit jealous that another woman had taken my son's heart. I'd thought maybe 74 years had made me paranoid instead of wise. But when Stuart closed his office door behind me and pulled out a thick folder with Nathan's name on it, I realized something that made my hands shake. My son had known. Whatever I'd sensed about Diane, Nathan had seen it too. And he'd done something about it. Stuart looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Part pity, part anger, part something like respect. He told me I should sit down because what he was about to tell me would change everything. That's when I learned that my son had left me everything that mattered. And more importantly, that's when I learned why. Stuart slid a document across his desk. My hands trembled as I picked it up, not from age, though I let him think that, but from something else entirely. Fear, anticipation, the sense that whatever was written on these pages would reshape everything I thought I knew about my son's last months. The will was dated 6 months before Nathan died, September 15th. I remembered that time. Nathan had called me more than usual, asked about my health, my finances, whether I needed anything. I'd thought he was just being a good son. Now I understood he'd been preparing. Stuart walked me through it slowly, the way you'd explain something to someone you're worried might not understand. I let him. At 74, I've learned that people tell you more when they think you need things simplified. They get comfortable. They let details slip. Nathan had left me the Aspen house, the vacation property he'd bought 3 years ago as an investment, $890,000 worth of Colorado mountain real estate. He'd left me both cars, the Mercedes he drove and the Range Rover Diane preferred, combined value around $140,000. And then Stuart got to the part that made my breath catch. The trust fund. I'd known about it vaguely. Diane's father had been wealthy as something in commercial real estate, and he'd set up a trust for his only daughter when she was 25. She'd mentioned it once or twice, always casually, like it wasn't important, just a little something her daddy had left her. Monthly payments to help her maintain her lifestyle. What I hadn't known was how much. $3.2 million. $15,000 a month paid out to Diane like clockwork since she'd turned 25. She was 32 now. 7 years of monthly payments, and barely touched the principal with the way it was invested. What I really hadn't known was that when Diane married Nathan, Her father's trust terms shifted. The trustee role, the person who controlled the distributions, who decided how much Diane could access and when that had transferred to her husband. Standard protection clause, Stewart explained. The father hadn't trusted Diane to manage it alone. Smart man, turned out, and when Nathan died, that trustee role didn't automatically go to Diane. It went to whoever Nathan designated in his will. He'd designated me. I stared at Stewart. The numbers weren't computing. Not because I couldn't understand them. I'd managed household finances for 50 years, raised a son on a teacher's salary before James's construction business took off, but because I couldn't understand why. Stewart must have seen the question in my face. He opened another folder. This one was thicker. He told me I should prepare myself, that what Nathan had discovered wasn't easy for a mother to hear. My son had hired a private investigator. The photos came out first. Diane and a man I didn't recognize. Younger, muscular, the kind of attractive that comes from spending hours in a gym. They were at restaurants, hotels, walking hand in hand through parks. The dates went back to years. 2 years while she was married to my son, while she was sitting at my Thanksgiving table, while she was playing the devoted wife. His name was Craig Rollins, Pilates instructor at the upscale gym Diane belonged to. 28 years old, and according to the investigator's notes, very interested in Diane's financial situation. But the photos weren't what made my chest tighten, it was the messages. Stewart had printouts, text conversations between Diane and Craig that the investigator had obtained. Stewart didn't explain how, and I didn't ask. I read them with growing horror. Diane complaining about Nathan, calling him boring old, saying she'd married him for security but couldn't stand another decade waiting for him to die. Naturally, so she could access everything. Craig asking about the trust fund, about life insurance, about what she'd inherit. And then the message that made my vision blur. Diane had written to Craig that maybe they needed to be more proactive, that accidents happen, that Nathan drove fast on mountain roads, and maybe a distraction, at the right moment, a suggestion to check something on his phone, a sudden need for him to look at her instead of the road. I couldn't finish reading. My hands were shaking for real now. Stewart reached across and gently took the papers from me. He told me the police had investigated Nathan's accident thoroughly. Weather conditions, brake failure analysis, toxicology, everything pointed to a genuine accident. The semi-driver had fallen asleep at the wheel, crossed lanes. No way Nathan could have avoided it. The messages were speculation, fantasy, horrible thoughts that thankfully never became reality. But Nathan had known. He'd seen those messages. He'd known his wife was having an affair and fantasizing about his death. And instead of confronting her, instead of divorcing her and giving her ammunition to claim she deserved half of everything he'd built, he'd quietly changed his will, protected his assets, protected me. Stewart leaned back in his chair and explained Nathan's strategy. As long as Diane didn't know about the will changes, she'd continue being careless. She'd reveal her true nature. And when she finally discovered that Nathan had left everything to me, including control of her trust fund, she'd have no legal ground to stand on. The evidence of her affair and her conversations with Craig would destroy any sympathy a judge might have for a grieving widow contesting her husband's will. Nathan had turned my trusteeship into a weapon. The trust terms gave me discretionary power. I could reduce her payments, investigate her expenses, even petition a court to remove her entirely if I found evidence of behavior contrary to the trust's intent. Her father had written strict moral clauses into the original document. He'd known his daughter. I sat in Stewart's office for 2 hours. He showed me everything. Bank statements proving Diane had been spending Nathan's money lavishly while secretly saving her trust fund payments, planning for a future without him. Hotel receipts for romantic weekends with Craig charged to Nathan's credit card while she told my son she was visiting friends. Social media posts she'd made and deleted, talking about waiting for her real life to start. By the time I left Stewart's office, my grief had transformed into something else, something colder, more focused. For 74 years, I'd tried to see the best in people. My mother taught me that. Find the good, give second chances, don't judge too harshly. But my mother also taught me another lesson, one I'd almost forgotten: protect your own. And when someone comes after your family, even after your family is gone, you don't roll over just because you're old. You use every year of experience, every lesson learned, every bit of wisdom earned to fight back. Stewart asked what I wanted to do. He could contact Diane immediately, inform her of the will's contents, start the legal process. Or and, he paused here, looking at me carefully, we could wait, observe, let Diane think she was winning while we documented everything she did, build an unassailable case. I thought about Nathan, about how carefully he'd planned this, how he'd trusted me to handle it right. At 74, I'd thought my days of strategic thinking were behind me. I'd thought I was entering the phase of life where you just coast, remember the past, wait for the end. My son had given me a different mission. I told Stuart we'd wait, watch, let Diane show us exactly who she was. And when the time was right, when we had everything we needed, I used the power Nathan gave me. Stuart smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who'd watched his friend die and wanted justice for him. He told me he thought Nathan had chosen his trustee very wisely. I stood to leave, feeling decades younger than I had when I'd walked in. At the door, I turned back. I asked Stuart one more question. Did he think Diane had actually planned to kill Nathan, or was it just talk? Stuart was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me he didn't know, but he said Nathan must have believed the threat was real, or he wouldn't have acted so decisively. My son had protected me from a woman he'd married, shared his life with, promised forever to. That meant he'd seen something truly dangerous. I drove home slowly, my mind racing. For 8 months after Nathan's death, I'd been the grieving mother, helpless, lost, old. Starting that day, I became something else entirely. I became the guardian of my son's legacy and the keeper of his revenge. Diane thought she was dealing with a confused old woman who'd be easy to manage. She was about to learn that 74 years of life had taught me exactly how to recognize a predator. And more importantly, how to trap one. The hardest acting I've ever done wasn't in my high school drama club back in 1968. It was sitting across from my daughter-in-law at Nathan's house 2 weeks after learning what she truly was, and pretending to be the harmless old widow she expected. Diane had called and asked me to come over. She said she needed help going through Nathan's things, that it was too painful to do alone, that she needed family support. The way she said family made my skin crawl, but I agreed sweetly. Told her of course I'd help, that we should stick together in our grief. I dressed carefully that morning, old cardigan, comfortable shoes, minimal makeup. I messed my hair just slightly, not enough to look neglected, but enough to look like a woman who wasn't quite holding it together. I practiced in the mirror. Confused expressions, trembling hands, the occasional pause like I'd forgotten what I was saying. At 74, people expect you to be a little scattered. I'd give Diane exactly what she expected. When I arrived at the house, my house now, though she didn't know it, Diane greeted me with a hug that felt like hugging a mannequin. She was dressed casually, yoga pants and a fitted top, but I noticed she'd had her nails done recently. Expensive manicure. Her hair was freshly highlighted. For a woman supposedly drowning in grief, she was maintaining her appearance remarkably well. She led me to Nathan's study. Boxers were already set up, labeled in her neat handwriting, keep, donate, trash. Very organized for someone too devastated to function. I played my part, moving slowly, touching Nathan's books with trembling fingers, tearing up at photos on his desk. Diane watched me. I could feel her evaluating, calculating. After a few minutes of my elderly grief performance, she relaxed, became more herself, started directing me to pack certain items, speaking a bit more sharply, with less of the soft sympathy she'd used on the phone. She began asking questions. Casual at first. Did I know if Nathan had life insurance? Where he kept important papers? Whether he'd ever mentioned anything about his financial planning? I played confused, said Nathan never discussed business with me, that I was just his mother, and those weren't things he'd burden me with. I saw relief flicker across her face. Then she moved to what she really wanted. She told me she'd been going through paperwork and was having trouble locating the deed to the house. The car titles, some investment documents she knew Nathan had. She asked if maybe Nathan had given me any papers for safekeeping, the way older people sometimes did, keeping important documents with their parents. The way she said it, older people with just the tiniest edge of condescension, like I was a child who might have been trusted with papers I couldn't possibly understand. I blinked at her slowly, shook my head, said Nathan never gave me papers, that I wouldn't know what to do with them anyway, that these things were too complicated for me. I watched her shoulders relax further. She actually patted my hand, told me not to worry, that she'd figure it all out. that I should just focus on remembering the good times with Nathan. Over the next hour, Diane revealed herself in small increments. She talked about needing to sell the house. Too many memories, she claimed, though I noticed she was already looking at real estate listings on her phone for luxury condos downtown. She mentioned the cars, how she couldn't possibly keep both, how she'd need to liquidate assets to move forward with her life. Her life, not their life, not Nathan's memory. Her future, already planned and mapped out. Barely 3 weeks after burying her husband, I played the sympathetic mother and told her she should do whatever she needed to heal, that Nathan would want her to be happy, that she was still young with her whole life ahead of her. Each word tasted like poison, but I smiled through it. Diane ate it up. She actually smiled back, genuine this time, and started talking more freely. She mentioned needing to meet with financial advisors, how she had to understand her complete financial picture now. She said something about the trust fund her father had left her, how it would help her transition, but she'd need to access more than usual to set up her new life. She looked at me and said she was so grateful Nathan had been smart about finances, that everything would work out. I nodded along, appearing to barely follow the conversation, asked her to repeat things, apologized for being slow, blamed it on grief and age. Each apology made her more careless. She started checking her phone while talking to me, only half paying attention because she'd decided I wasn't important, just the old mother who needed managing but posed no threat. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her whole face changed, softened, brightened. A small smile played at her lips. She typed something quickly and I saw it. Just a glimpse, but enough. The contact name, Craig, with a heart emoji. She caught me looking, and the smile vanished. She told me it was just her trainer checking in, that exercise was helping her cope with the grief. The lie came so smoothly, I almost believed it myself, but I'd seen that look. I'd felt it myself 52 years ago when James used to call me during the day just to hear my voice. That wasn't trainer and client. That was intimacy, affection. My son had been dead less than a month, and his widow was smiling at messages from her lover in his study, while his mother packed his belongings 10 feet away. I felt rage then, hot and pure and focused. But 74 years of living teaches you control. I let my face show nothing but vague confusion. Asked if we should take a break, have some tea. Diane agreed quickly, probably wanting time alone to text Craig back. In the kitchen, Nathan's beautiful kitchen with the marble counters he'd been so proud, AVI made tea with shaking hands. Real shaking this time, not performed. Diane sat at the island scrolling through her phone, occasionally sighing dramatically like grief was washing over her. I watched her and thought about Nathan sitting in this exact spot for breakfast. My son, who'd grown up in a modest 3-bedroom ranch, worked 2 jobs through law school, built himself into something successful and proud, who'd loved this woman enough to marry her, trust her, share his life with her. And she'd betrayed him with a Pilates instructor young enough to be her younger brother, counting days until she could cash in on his death. Diane looked up suddenly and caught something in my expression. For just a second, I'd let the mask slip. She looked at me strangely and asked if I was all right. I recovered quickly, told her I'd just remembered Nathan sitting in that exact spot, how much I missed him. Tears came, real ones this time, and Diane's suspicion melted back into dismissive sympathy. She told me maybe I should go home and rest, that I seemed tired, that grief was hard on someone my age, that I shouldn't push myself. She'd finished the packing. I agreed meekly, gathered my purse with fumbling hands, let her guide me to the door like I was fragile. At the door, she hugged me again, told me she was glad we had each other, that family was so important now, asked if I needed anything, if I was managing okay financially, if she could help me with anything complicated that might be too much for me to handle alone. Every word a probe, every question searching for whether I knew something, whether I'd be a problem, and every answer I gave reassured her that I was exactly what I appeared, a grieving old woman, confused and helpless, no threat whatsoever. I drove away slowly, waving at her from my old sedan. In my rearview mirror, I saw her already on her phone before I'd even left the driveway, probably texting Craig about the silly old woman she'd just handled. That night, I called Stuart, told him about the visit, about Diane's questions, about Craig's message. He asked how I was holding up, if playing this role was too difficult. I told him the truth. At 74, I'd spent decades being underestimated. People see gray hair and assume diminished capacity. They see wrinkles and think confused. They see 74 and expect helpless. Diane's mistake, her fatal mistake, was believing the mask. She'd looked at me and seen everything she expected: old, grieving, simple, manageable. She'd never considered that behind the trembling hands and confused questions was a woman who'd raised a brilliant son, survived losing a husband, and learned over 74 years exactly how to read people. Stuart asked what I wanted to do next. I told him to wait, let Diane get comfortable, let her think she was winning. I wanted to see how far she'd go, how careless she'd become. Nathan had given me the tools. Now I needed to let Diane give me the justification to use them. Because at 74, I'd learned the most important lesson: patience. The young are always in a hurry. They make mistakes. They get sloppy. All I had to do was wait and watch while Diane revealed exactly who she was. And then, when the time was right, I'd show her who I was. Not the confused old widow. Not the harmless grandmother. But the woman my son trusted with his final revenge. The mother who'd spent 74 years learning exactly how to protect her family even from beyond the grave. Diane thought she was playing me. She had no idea the game had already started. And that, at this game, the long game, the patient game age, was my greatest advantage. The thing about being 74 is that people forget you have eyes. They talk around you, past you, like you're furniture. In the months after Nathan's death, I became a piece of furniture with a very good memory. Stuart and I developed a system. Every interaction with Diane, I documented. Not formally, that would have looked suspicious. Just an old woman's diary, the kind I'd kept on and off for 50 years. Dates, times, conversations, what Diane said, how she said it, the little inconsistencies that added up. But documentation wasn't enough. Stuart explained that if we wanted to use my power as trustee effectively, if we wanted to reduce Diane's payments, or potentially remove her from the trust entirely, we needed evidence that would satisfy a judge, not just that she'd had an affair. Colorado had no-fault divorce. Infidelity alone wouldn't justify trust modifications. We needed proof that she was violating the trust's moral clauses, misusing funds, or demonstrating character issues that contradicted the trust's original intent. Her father, it turned out, had been specific. The trust was meant to support a lifestyle of dignity, responsibility, and family values. Stuart had obtained the original documents from the firm that had drafted them 23 years ago. The language was old-fashioned, clearly written by a wealthy man worried his daughter would waste her inheritance. There were clauses about maintaining respectable conduct, avoiding scandal, using funds appropriately. Diane's father had known his daughter. He'd tried to protect her from herself. Now I'd use his protection to protect Nathan's memory. The real breakthrough came 6 weeks after my visit to the house. I got a call from Nathan's neighbor, Mrs. Patricia Chen. She was 81, a widow herself, and she'd always liked Nathan. She told me she was sorry to bother me, but she thought I should know something. Her voice shook with what sounded like genuine distress. Diane had moved someone into the house. Mrs. Chen described him: younger man, very fit, drove a flashy car. He'd moved in about a week ago with suitcases and gym equipment. Mrs. Chen had seen them through the windows, laughing, drinking wine, acting like a couple. No pretense of separate rooms or propriety. Just openly living together barely 2 months after Nathan died. I thanked Mrs. Chen, my voice breaking in a way that wasn't entirely performance. She apologized again for telling me, said she knew it must be painful, but she thought family should know. I told her she'd done the right thing. I called Stuart immediately. He was quiet for a moment, then told me this was exactly what we'd been waiting for. A grieving widow living with her lover in her dead husband's house, my house, legally, was the kind of behavioral evidence that would resonate with a judge, especially combined with everything else we had. But Stuart cautioned, patience. We needed more. We needed financial evidence. Proof that Diane was using her trust fund inappropriately now that she thought she was free from oversight. Nathan had controlled the trust during their marriage, and according to the records Stuart obtained, he'd been relatively generous but careful. He'd approved the 15,000 monthly payments, but had denied several requests for larger distributions, one for a luxury car upgrade, another for an expensive vacation to Europe. He'd documented his reasoning. The trust was for security, not extravagance. Now Diane thought she'd inherit control herself. She didn't know yet that I held the keys. Stuart suggested we wait 1 more month before revealing the will. Let Diane establish patterns. Let her spend money, make plans, maybe request larger trust distributions that would still go through the temporary administrator the court had appointed pending estate settlement. Build a picture of who she became when she thought no one was watching. Those weeks were the hardest of my life. Harder even than losing James, because at least his death was natural, expected after his heart disease diagnosis. This was watching my son's memory be desecrated. This was seeing the woman he'd loved enough to marry parade her betrayal publicly, while I had to smile and pretend everything was fine. Diane called me occasionally. Always brief, always with an excuse, checking in on me, she claimed, making sure I was okay. But I recognized the calls for what they were: reconnaissance, making sure I wasn't suspicious, wasn't asking questions, wasn't becoming a problem. I played my part perfectly, confused about dates sometimes, repeating myself, asking her to explain things twice. Once I even called her by the wrong name, called her Denise instead of Diane. She corrected me with barely concealed impatience, and I apologized profusely, blamed my old memory. I could practically hear her relaxing on the other end of the line. Meanwhile, Stuart worked behind the scenes. He contacted the investigator Nathan had used and had him continue surveillance. The photos that came back were damning. Diane and Craig at expensive restaurants, charging meals to credit cards funded by her trust payments, shopping trips where Diane bought Craig designer clothes, a weekend trip to Las Vegas that cost more than my monthly rent. The investigator also found Diane's social media. She'd made her accounts private after Nathan died. Smart of her, but she'd forgotten about some older accounts, platforms she rarely used but hadn't deleted. There were posts from a year ago, 2 years ago, complaints about her boring husband, comments on attractive men's photos, jokes about marrying for money that her friends had laughed at with emojis. And then the investigator found something that made my blood run cold all over again. Diane had posted on a private Facebook group for young wives of older men. It was a closed group, meant to be confidential, but the investigator had Stewart didn't explain, and I didn't ask. The posts went back 3 years. Diane complaining about Nathan, calling him controlling because he wouldn't approve unlimited trust fund distributions, saying she'd made a mistake marrying someone so much older, so boring, so obsessed with his career. Other women in the group had given advice, some sympathetic, others more calculating. And one thread, from 18 months ago, made me physically ill. Diane had written about Craig, about falling for someone age-appropriate, exciting, who made her feel alive. Another woman had responded asking what she'd do about her husband. Diane's response: she was waiting it out, playing the good wife, because divorce would mean losing access to Nathan's money and possibly her trust fund, depending on how vindictive he got. Better to wait. Eventually the age gap would take care of itself naturally, and she'd inherit everything. Eventually the age gap would take care of itself naturally. Nathan had been 48, healthy, active. That phrasing wasn't about waiting for old age. That was about expecting him to die decades before his time. And when natural causes seemed to slow, she'd started having conversations with Craig about helping things along. Stuart printed everything, created a file that grew thicker by the week, financial records showing frivolous spending, social media posts revealing her character, photos documenting her moving Craig in weeks after Nathan's funeral, witness statements from Mrs. Chen and other neighbors about the inappropriate behavior. And at the center of it all, the investigator's original file that Nathan had compiled, the affair, the messages about accelerating Nathan's death, the evidence that my son had known his wife was waiting for him to die. 3 months after Nathan's funeral, Stuart told me we had enough, more than enough. It was time to execute Nathan's plan. But I'd learned something in those 3 months. Something about myself. At 74, I'd thought I was finished with life's battles. I'd raised my son, lost my husband, settled into the quiet years. I'd thought my days of strategy and planning and fighting were over. Nathan had given me one final mission, and I'd discovered I was good at it. Patient, careful, strategic. All those years as a wife and mother, negotiating, compromising, reading people. They'd prepared me for this. Every PTA meeting where I'd dealt with difficult parents, every school fundraiser I'd organized, every family gathering where I'd kept the peace between relatives who didn't like each other. It had all been training. Diane had underestimated me because I was old. She'd looked at my gray hair and my modest clothes and my occasional fumbling and decided I was no threat. She'd forgotten that 74 years means 74 years of experience, of learning, of watching people reveal themselves. I told Stuart I wanted one more thing before we acted. I wanted to see Diane face to face. One last time, with her thinking I was the harmless old woman. I wanted to look her in the eye and know I'd given her every chance to show remorse, to show any hint that my son's death meant something to her. Stuart advised against it, said it was unnecessary, potentially risky. But I insisted. At 74, I've earned the right to trust my instincts. I called Diane and asked if I could take her to lunch. My treat. I told her I'd been thinking about Nathan, about family, about how we needed to stay close. She agreed with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested obligation rather than desire. But she agreed. We met at a quiet restaurant in Boulder. Nothing fancy, just the kind of place an elderly widow might afford. Diane arrived 15 minutes late, distracted, checking her phone. She apologized vaguely, blamed traffic. I saw Craig's name on her phone screen before she turned it face down. We made small talk. I asked about her plans. She told me she was thinking of traveling, maybe moving to California, starting fresh. She'd met someone. She admitted carefully a friend who was helping her through her grief. She watched my reaction. I smiled kindly, told her Nathan would want her to be happy, that she shouldn't be alone. Relief flooded her face. She actually reached across and squeezed my hand, told me I was so understanding, that not everyone would be. I knew what she meant. She was testing whether I'd be a problem when she tried to claim Nathan's estate. I asked about the house. She said she'd been meaning to talk to me about that she'd need to sell it soon, that it was too painful to stay there. She said it so smoothly, like she owned it, like it was hers to sell. I took a breath, asked if she ever thought about Nathan, really thought about him, what he wanted, what he'd dreamed of, what he'd hoped for his future. Diane's expression shifted. For just a second, I saw annoyance flicker across her face. Then she composed herself, put on the grieving widow mask, told me of course she thought about him constantly, that she missed him every day, that their time together had been precious, every word a lie. And she told those lies to his mother over lunch, while her lover waited at home in my son's house, while she planned to sell everything Nathan had built. I smiled, nodded, played the convinced old woman, and I made my decision. When we parted ways in the parking lot, Diane hugged me, told me again how glad she was that we had each other. I hugged her back and thought about Nathan, about how he'd protected me even in death, about how he'd known exactly who she was. That night, I called Stuart, told him I was ready. It was time to show Diane exactly what Nathan had left behind. Not money, not property, but something far more powerful, the truth, and the weapon to wield it. At 74 years old, I was about to become my son's instrument of justice, and I was going to make sure Diane remembered every single year of experience that she'd dismissed as weakness. Stuart scheduled the meeting for a Tuesday morning. Neutral ground, his office conference room. Formal, legal, the kind of setting that makes everything feel official and irreversible. He sent Diane a letter marked urgent, requesting her presence for the reading of Nathan's will and discussion of estate matters. Very standard, very proper. The kind of letter that wouldn't raise alarm because widows expect these meetings. They expect to learn about life insurance policies and retirement accounts and all the financial logistics of death. Diane called me the night before, asked if I'd received a similar letter, if I knew what it was about. I told her I had, that Stuart had mentioned something about finalizing Nathan's affairs, but that I didn't really understand legal matters. I asked if she'd be there, said it would be comforting to have her present because these things confused me. She agreed readily, probably relieved that the old woman would have someone to guide her through complicated proceedings. I chose my outfit carefully that morning. A dress I'd worn to Nathan's funeral, somber, respectable, the kind of thing a grieving mother would wear. I left my hair a bit messy, applied minimal makeup, every detail mattered. I wanted Diane to see exactly what she expected, right up until the moment everything changed. I arrived at Stuart's office early. He had coffee waiting, and we reviewed everything one final time. The will, the trust documents, the evidence files, the strategy. Stuart asked again if I was sure, if I was ready for what would happen when Diane learned the truth. I told him I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. At 74, you learn that certainty is a rare gift. Most of life is ambiguity, compromise, doubt, but some moments demand absolute conviction. This was one of them. Diane arrived exactly on time, which surprised me. She was dressed professionally, black pantsuit, modest jewelry, playing the part of the grieving widow for the lawyer. She greeted me with a hug, asked how I was holding up. I played fragile, let her guide me to a chair like I needed assistance. Stuart invited us to sit. His conference table was large, imposing. Legal pads and documents were arranged precisely. Another man was present. Stuart introduced him as Robert Hayes, an estate attorney and witness. Standard procedure, Stuart explained. Diane nodded, relaxed. Everything seemed normal. Stuart began with condolences, formalities, then he opened the folder containing Nathan's will. Diane leaned forward slightly. This was what she'd been waiting for. 3 months of playing devoted widow, and now the payoff. Stuart read the standard opening clauses. Then he got to the distributions. His voice was steady, professional, clinical. The house in Boulder to Virginia, Caldwell, his mother. Diane's head snapped up, confusion crossed her face. Stuart continued without pausing. The vacation property in Aspen to Virginia Caldwell. The Mercedes and Range Rover to Virginia Caldwell. All investment accounts, retirement funds, and savings to Virginia Caldwell. Diane's face went white. She looked at me, then at Stuart. Told him there must be a mistake. That she was Nathan's wife. That marital property laws meant she was entitled to half of everything at minimum. Her voice had an edge now, the soft widow persona cracking. Stuart calmly explained that Nathan had been meticulous. The house was purchased before their marriage, titled solely in his name. The cars were gifts to himself. The investment accounts were inherited from his father or earned before marriage. Everything Nathan owned individually, he'd left to me. The only marital assets were jointly held accounts and household items, which Diane was welcome to keep. Then, Stuart paused, looked directly at Diane, told her there was one more asset to discuss, the trust fund. I watched Diane's face carefully. She hadn't thought about the trust in terms of Nathan's will because it wasn't Nathan's asset, it was hers, established by her father. But I saw the moment she remembered that when she'd married Nathan, the trustee role had transferred to him, that Nathan had controlled her money for 6 years. Diane asked slowly what happened to the trustee designation now that Nathan was deceased. Stuart slid a document across the table, told her that Nathan's will explicitly designated a successor trustee for the trust, as was his legal right as the current trustee and Diane's spouse. He'd designated me. The silence in that room was absolute. Diane stared at the document like it was written in a foreign language. I watched her try to process it, her mind working through the implications. Her father's trust gave the trustee complete discretionary control. Whoever controlled the trustee role controlled her money. And Nathan had given that control to his mother. Diane's voice was shaky when she finally spoke. She said that couldn't be right. That Nathan wouldn't do that. That I was just his mother. That I didn't know anything about financial management. That this had to be a mistake. Stuart's voice remained calm. Told her there was no mistake. The will was properly executed, witnessed, filed, completely legal. Nathan had updated it 6 months before his death. Been of sound mind, clearly understood his actions. Diane turned to me. Her mask was completely gone now. She asked what I knew about this, why Nathan would do such a thing. Her tone wasn't respectful anymore. It was demanding, almost accusing. I looked at her. Let the confused old woman expression fade from my face. Let her see me clearly for the first time. I told her I'd been wondering the same thing. Why my son would take such unusual steps. Why he'd put so much in my name, give me so much control. It seemed strange. Until Stuart showed me something else. Stuart opened another folder, the thick one. He told Diane we needed to discuss some concerns that had come to light regarding the trust administration. He began laying out photos. Diane and Craig at restaurants, walking hand in hand, kissing on a street corner. The dates visible, time-stamped, all during her marriage to Nathan. Diane's face went from white to red. She started to speak, but Stuart continued. More photos. Craig, moving into the house that was legally mine, moving in barely 2 months after Nathan's funeral. Then Stuart laid out the financial records, credit card statements showing charges to expensive restaurants, hotels, shopping trips, all paid with money from Diane's trust fund distributions, all spent on her affair while married to my son. Diane found her voice, told Stuart that her personal life was none of his business, that what she did with her trust money was her decision, that an affair didn't change her legal rights. Stewart agreed that normally she'd be correct. Colorado is a no-fault state. Infidelity alone wouldn't impact estate distribution. But, and he emphasized this word, her trust fund was different. Her trust had specific moral clauses, language about maintaining respectable conduct, using funds responsibly, upholding family values. Stewart read directly from her father's trust document. The original language written 23 years ago by a man who'd known his daughter would need protection from herself. Then Stewart laid out the final piece. The social media posts, the private Facebook group messages, Diane's own words, printed in black and white, complaining about Nathan, talking about waiting for the age gap to take care of itself naturally, discussing her affair, joking about marrying for money, and finally, the messages with Craig, the ones Nathan's investigator had obtained, the conversations about accelerating things, about accidents, about not waiting any longer. Diane's face was ashen. She whispered that Nathan's death was investigated, ruled an accident, that those messages were just talk, fantasy, nothing real. Stewart agreed. The police investigation found no evidence of foul play. The messages weren't criminal evidence, but they were evidence of character, of intent, of the kind of person Diane truly was, and combined with everything else, the affair, the immediate cohabitation with her lover, the frivolous spending, the social media posts, they painted a clear picture, a picture that directly contradicted the trust's requirements for moral conduct and responsible behavior. I spoke for the first time. My voice was steady, clear, not confused or elderly at all. I told Diane that as the new trustee, I had significant concerns about how she was using the trust funds, that I'd be reviewing all expenditures, that going forward, I'd be exercising my discretionary authority to ensure distributions aligned with the trust's intended purpose. Diane stared at me. For 3 months, she'd dismissed me. The grieving old mother, harmless, manageable, forgettable. Now she was seeing someone else entirely. Stewart explained the technicalities. As trustee, I had complete authority over distributions. I could continue the $15,000 monthly payments, or I could reduce them. The trust terms allowed for anywhere from $3,000 monthly, the bare minimum for basic needs, up to the full $15,000, at my sole discretion. Furthermore, if I found evidence of conduct violating the trust's moral clauses, I could petition the court to modify distribution terms or even remove Diane as beneficiary entirely. With the evidence we had, Stewart was confident a judge would support significant restrictions. Diane finally exploded. Told us we couldn't do this, that the money was hers, her father left it for her, that we were trying to steal it. She threatened lawsuits, said she'd fight us. Stewart calmly explained that she was welcome to contest the trust administration, but it would require filing public court documents that would include all the evidence we'd presented, the affair, the messages, the social media posts. Everything would become part of the public record. Her friends would see it, her family, everyone would know exactly who she was. I watched Diane's face as the trap closed around her. Nathan had built this so carefully, given me the power but also given me the evidence, made it so that fighting would hurt Diane more than accepting defeat. She looked at me with pure hatred, asked what I wanted. Her voice was shaking with rage she could no longer control. I folded my hands calmly, told her I wanted justice for my son. I wanted her to understand that actions have consequences, that you can't betray someone, mock their memory, and expect to profit from their death. Then I laid out the terms. Diane would accept a reduced trust distribution, $3,000 monthly, enough for basic expenses but nothing more. She would vacate my house within 30 days. She would sign a legal document acknowledging the trust arrangement and agreeing not to contest it. In return, I wouldn't petition the court for her complete removal from the trust, and I wouldn't pursue civil action for her unauthorized occupation of my property. Diane looked between Stewart and me, searching for a way out, finding none. Finally, she asked what would happen if she refused. I smiled, not kindly. I told her I'd file a petition with the court immediately, submit all our evidence, seek her complete removal from the trust, and I'd file a lawsuit for her unauthorized use of my house. Make everything public. Let everyone see what she'd done. At 74, I learned that sometimes the cruelest kindness is giving someone a choice between two bad options. Diane could accept reduced distributions and quiet defeat, or she could fight and lose everything publicly. Stewart added one more detail. The trust principle was protected. Di couldn't touch that. But I controlled distributions for as long as I lived. Diane was 32 years old. I was 74. Statistically, I had 10, maybe 15 years left. That's 10 to 15 years of living on $3,000 a month instead of $15,000, living with the knowledge that she'd played a game and lost to an old woman she'd dismissed as irrelevant. Or she could fight, and I'd make sure she got nothing at all. The power wasn't just in the money. It was in the time, in knowing that for a decade or more, every month, Diane would receive that reduced payment and remember the old woman who'd outsmarted her, remember the son she'd betrayed, remember that she'd underestimated someone because of age and learned exactly how expensive that mistake could be. Diane sat in silence for a long time. I could see her calculating, trying to find angles, options, escape routes, finding nothing but walls Nathan had built and I'd reinforced. Finally, she asked where Craig was in all this. If we were going after him too. I told her Craig was irrelevant. He was just a symptom of who she was. This wasn't about him. This was about her, about what she'd done to Nathan, what she'd taken from me. Diane's shoulders slumped, defeated. She asked when she needed to decide. Stewart told her we needed an answer within 48 hours. After that, we'd proceed with court filings. Stewart handed Diane copies of everything, the will, the trust documents, the evidence, told her to show them to her own attorney if she wanted. We were confident in our position. Diane looked at me one last time, asked how I could do this, how I could be so cruel. I stepped closer to her, let her see the steel that 74 years had forged, told her I'd spent 3 months watching her disrespect my son's memory, move her lover into his house, spend money Nathan had earned while mocking his death. I'd watched her play the grieving widow while planning her future with another man. I told her she'd mistaken patience for weakness, mistaken age for inability, mistaken a mother's grief for confusion, and now she was learning that the most dangerous enemy is the one you never saw coming. Diane left Stewart's office without another word. I watched her go, shoulders hunched, the confident woman from earlier completely gone. Stewart asked how I felt. I told him the truth. At 74, I'd thought my days of fighting were over. I'd thought I was just waiting out my remaining years, living quietly, causing no trouble. Nathan had given me one final mission, and I'd discovered something about myself. I was good at this, better than I'd known. All those years of experience, of watching people, of learning patience and strategy, they'd been preparation for this moment. My son had trusted me with his revenge, and I delivered it perfectly. Diane didn't call for 2 days, 48 hours of silence while Stewart and I waited. I won't pretend I wasn't nervous. At 74, you've seen enough of life to know that cornered people are unpredictable, dangerous. Sometimes, I'd pushed Diane into a corner with walls on every side, and I wasn't entirely sure how she'd react. Stewart had advised me to stay alert, vary my routine, maybe stay with friends for a few days. He didn't say it directly, but I understood he was worried Diane might do something desperate. But I refused. I'd lived in my small condo for 12 years. I wasn't going to be driven from my home by a woman who'd already taken too much from me. On the second day, late afternoon, Stewart called. Diane's attorney had contacted him. She was accepting the terms. I felt something release in my chest. Relief, yes, but also something sharper. Victory. Diane had calculated her options and realized she had none. The evidence was too strong. The trust terms too clear. Fighting would cost her everything, and accepting defeat would at least leave her with something. $3,000 a month wasn't nothing, but it wasn't the life she'd planned. Not the luxury she'd expected to fund with Nathan's death and her trust fund. Not enough for expensive restaurants and shopping trips and supporting a boyfriend who'd only been interested in her money to begin with. Stewart scheduled a signing for the following week. Formal documents acknowledging the trust arrangement, agreeing to the reduced distributions, committing to vacate the house within 30 days. Everything legal and binding. But something interesting happened in the days before that signing. I started getting calls. First was Monica, Diane's closest friend, the one who'd stood beside her at the funeral, helping support the grieving widow. Monica's tone was careful, sympathetic. She told me she'd heard there were complications with Nathan's estate, that Diane was very upset. She wondered if maybe there'd been some misunderstanding. Perhaps we could all sit down together, work things out like family. I recognized the call for what it was. Diane testing to see if I'd fold under social pressure, trying to use mutual connections to make me feel guilty or reconsider. I thanked Monica politely for her concern, told her the estate was being handled through proper legal channels, that everything was already settled. Monica persisted slightly, said that Diane was saying I was being unreasonable, that Nathan wouldn't have wanted family conflict. I let the words hang for a moment, then asked Monica if Diane had mentioned Craig, the man living in Nathan's house barely 2 months after my son's funeral. Silence on the other end of the line. Then Monica made an excuse and hung up quickly. The next call came from Diane's aunt, a woman named Patricia who'd been at the wedding 6 years ago. She was more direct, told me she'd heard I was trying to control Diane's inheritance, that it was inappropriate for me to interfere in what Nathan had left his wife. Her tone suggested she thought I was a bitter old woman trying to punish Diane out of spite. I asked Patricia if Diane had shown her the evidence we'd compiled. The affair, the messages, the social media posts. Patricia said those were private matters, that everyone made mistakes, that young people deserved forgiveness and second chances. I told Patricia that forgiveness was between Diane and God. I was just executing Nathan's will and managing a trust according to its terms. If she had concerns about the legality of my actions, she was welcome to consult an attorney. Otherwise, this was family business that didn't concern her. Patricia huffed and told me I'd regret being so harsh. That karma had a way of coming back around. I almost laughed. At 74, I'd seen enough karma to know it works both ways. Diane had karma coming, and I was just the delivery system. The third call was the most interesting. It came from Craig. I didn't recognize the number. When I answered, a young man's voice asked to speak with Virginia Caldwell. I confirmed, and he identified himself, said we should talk, that there were things I should know about Diane, about her and Nathan's marriage, about the real situation. I let him talk. Craig told me that Diane had said I was making things difficult, being unreasonable about the estate, that she was stressed and upset. He suggested in a tone that tried for friendly but came out manipulative, that maybe if I was more flexible, more understanding, everyone could move forward peacefully. Then he made the mistake of implying that he and Diane were planning a future together, that they'd appreciate it if family drama didn't complicate things, that I should think about what Nathan would really want, which was for his wife to be happy. I let him finish. Then I spoke very clearly, told him I knew exactly who he was, that I'd seen every photo, read every message, that I knew he'd been having an affair with my son's wife for 2 years, that I knew what they'd discussed about Nathan's death. Craig started to sputter, to deny. I cut him off, told him that he should be very careful about contacting me again, that harassment of a 74-year-old woman could have legal consequences, that he should focus on finding a new source of income, because Diane's financial situation had changed dramatically and permanently. I hung up before he could respond. Stuart laughed when I told him about the call, said I'd handled it perfectly, but he was also concerned. The fact that Craig had contacted me meant Diane was getting desperate, testing approaches, looking for leverage or weaknesses. The signing was scheduled for Thursday morning. Same conference room, same witnesses. This time, though, the atmosphere was different. Diane arrived alone, no friends for support. She looked tired, older. The stress was showing in ways her expensive skincare couldn't hide. She barely looked at me, just sat down, reviewed the documents with her attorney, a young man, who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the whole situation. He whispered something to her. She shook her head sharply. He whispered again, more insistently. She turned to him and said something I couldn't hear, but her expression made it clear. Just get this over with. The signing took 20 minutes. Diane's signature was sharp, angry slashes of ink. When it was done, Stuart provided her with copies and a formal notice to vacate the property within 30 days. Diane took the papers without a word. As we were leaving, though, she finally spoke. Not to Stuart or the attorneys, but directly to me. Her voice was low, bitter. She told me I'd won, that I must be very proud of myself, that I'd gotten exactly what I wanted, fringe control, the satisfaction of destroying her life. I stopped, turned to face her fully, told her very quietly that I hadn't destroyed her life. She'd done that herself. Every choice, the affair, the messages, moving Craig in, mocking Nathan's memory. Those were her decisions. I was just holding her accountable for them. Diane's eyes filled with tears. For a moment, I almost felt something like pity. She was young. She'd made terrible choices. And now she was paying for them in ways she'd never imagined. But then she said something that erased any sympathy I might have felt. She told me that Nathan hadn't been perfect either. That he'd been controlling, obsessed with his career, never home. That their marriage had problems long before Craig. That if I knew everything, I'd understand why she'd needed someone else. I stepped closer. Close enough that she had to look me in the eye. Told her that Nathan had been my son for 48 years before he was her husband for 6. That I knew him better than she ever would. That yes, he worked hard because he'd been taught that you build something with your life, that you earn what you have. That he'd given her a comfortable life, a beautiful home, respect, and she'd repaid him by counting the days until he died. I told her that whatever problems their marriage had, they didn't justify what she'd done. They didn't excuse planning his death with her lover. They didn't excuse moving that lover into his house before his body was cold in the ground. Diane's face crumpled. But I wasn't finished. I told her she'd gotten off easy. That $3,000 a month was generous considering what she deserved. That she should take her reduced distributions, live quietly, and be grateful I didn't pursue having her removed from the trust entirely. Then I walked away, left her standing in Stuart's hallway, crying. I didn't look back. In the parking lot, Stuart caught up with me. Asked if I was all right. I told him I was fine, better than fine. For months, I'd been playing a role, the confused old woman, the helpless widow, the manageable mother-in-law. It had been necessary, strategic, but exhausting. Today, I'd finally spoken my truth, looked Diane in the eye, and told her exactly what I thought. At 74, that kind of honesty is liberating. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched the consequences unfold. Mrs. Nathan's neighbor called to tell me Diane was moving out. There were boxers, a moving truck, arguments visible through the windows. Craig had apparently moved out first. Mrs. Chen had seen him loading his car and leaving 3 days after the signing. Diane was alone again. The house would need cleaning, repairs, but Stuart had already arranged for property management. We'd rent it out, probably. I didn't need it. My condo was perfect for one elderly woman and I couldn't bear to live in the place where Diane had betrayed Nathan's memory. But I'd kept it from her. That was what mattered. Nathan had bought that house with money he'd earned. He'd wanted me to have it. And now I did, while Diane moved into a small apartment that $3,000 a month could afford. Stuart also informed me that the first reduced distribution had been processed, $3,000 instead of $15,000. He'd included a formal notice with it, reminding Diane of the trust terms and my discretionary authority. Professional, legal, permanent. I thought about Diane opening that statement, seeing the reduced amount, knowing it would be this way every month for years, knowing that the old woman she'd dismissed was now the gatekeeper to her money, and would be for the rest of my natural life. At 74, I'm statistically likely to live another 10 to 15 years, maybe longer. My mother made it to 89, and I've got her constitution. Every month for a decade or more, Diane would receive that reminder. Every month, she'd remember that underestimating someone because of age was the most expensive mistake she'd ever made. But I also knew something else. Cornered animals bite. Diane had accepted the terms because she had no choice. But acceptance isn't the same as defeat. Stuart had warned me to stay alert. People in her position sometimes looked for revenge when legal options failed. I wasn't afraid, but I was careful. I varied my routine, made sure friends knew where I was, kept my doors locked. At 74, caution isn't paranoia, it's wisdom. And I watched, waited, because I had a feeling this wasn't quite over. Diane had signed the papers, accepted the terms. But she'd also looked at me with hatred that didn't fade just because documents were notarized. Nathan had protected me with his will. He'd given me weapons. But he'd also left me in a position where I'd made a powerful enemy out of a desperate woman. And the one thing 74 years had taught me was that desperate people don't always follow logical patterns. The game was won, but I wasn't ready to declare victory and let my guard down. Because there was still one more move to make. One final piece of Nathan's plan that would seal everything permanently. And I was waiting for exactly the right moment to execute it. The final move came 3 weeks after Diane vacated the house. Stewart called me on a Monday morning and told me the court had scheduled a hearing. Diane was contesting the trust administration after all. I wasn't surprised. Cornered animals always bite eventually. Her petition claimed I was unfit to serve as trustee due to my age and lack of financial expertise. She argued that I was acting out of personal animosity rather than the trust's best interests. She requested the court appoint an independent trustee and restore her full distributions. Her attorney had even included statements from Monica and Aunt Patricia, claiming I was vindictive and unreasonable. Stewart read me the filing over the phone. I could hear the concern in his voice. He told me that while our evidence was strong, judges could be unpredictable. Age discrimination worked both ways. If Diane's attorney painted me as a confused elderly woman acting emotionally rather than rationally, we might face complications. I told Stewart not to worry. This was exactly what I'd been waiting for. You see, Nathan had left me one more gift, something I'd been holding in reserve. Something I'd known I'd need when Diane inevitably fought back. My son had understood human nature better than she ever gave him credit for. He'd known his wife would accept defeat only until she found a way to fight, and he'd prepared for that too. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. Stewart and I spent that time preparing. He warned me the process would be difficult, that Diane's attorney would attack my competence, my motives, my age, that I'd need to testify, answer questions, possibly face hostile examination. He asked multiple times if I was certain I wanted to go through with this. I told him I'd never been more certain of anything. At 74, I'd testified before, not in court, but in other high-stakes situations. School board meetings when Nathan was young, and I'd fought for better resources. Insurance hearings after James died and companies tried to deny claims. You learn to hold your ground, to present facts calmly, to not let people's dismissiveness shake your confidence. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my condo with a cup of tea, the same cup James had bought me 40 years ago, chipped now but still functional, and thought about Nathan, about the son who'd been everything to me, who'd grown into a man I was proud of, who'd died too young, with too much life still ahead of him. He'd known Diane was dangerous. He'd seen it, documented it, protected against it, and now I was going to finish what he started. The courthouse was intimidating. All marble and echoing hallways. Stewart met me at the entrance, along with Robert Hayes, the estate attorney who'd witnessed the original will reading. They both looked nervous. I felt calm, focused, ready. Diane was already inside the courtroom. She'd dressed conservatively, navy suit, minimal makeup, hair pulled back, playing the responsible young woman being victimized by an unreasonable elder. Her attorney was older, extremely expensive. She'd clearly spent money she didn't have anymore on legal representation, hoping to regain access to her full trust. The judge was a woman in her 60s, Judge Patricia Morrison. Stewart had told me she had a reputation for being fair but no nonsense. She didn't suffer fools or time wasters. She valued evidence over emotion. Perfect. The hearing began with Diane's attorney presenting his case. He painted me as an elderly woman acting out of grief and spite. He claimed I lacked the financial sophistication to manage a multi-million-dollar trust. He brought up my age repeatedly, 74 years old, limited education, no professional financial experience. He implied I was being manipulated by Stewart, that I didn't really understand what I was doing. He called Monica as a witness. She testified that I'd been hostile toward Diane, unreasonable, refusing to discuss things rationally. She claimed Diane was devastated by Nathan's death and I was making her grief worse by punishing her financially. Aunt Patricia testified next, said I was bitter, jealous of Diane's youth, angry that Nathan had chosen a wife instead of remaining devoted to his mother. She actually said that implied I had some kind of unhealthy attachment to my son. It was offensive and absurd, but she said it with conviction. Then Diane's attorney called an expert witness, a financial advisor who testified that reducing distributions from $15,000 to $3,000 monthly was overly punitive and not in the trust's best interests. That such a dramatic reduction suggested emotional decision-making rather than sound financial management. I sat quietly through all of it. Stewart had coached Madonna React. Don't show emotion. Let them make their case. They were building a narrative. Let them commit to it fully before we dismantled it. Finally, Diane herself took the stand. Her attorney led her through her testimony carefully. She talked about losing Nathan, about how difficult the grief had been. She cried real tears this time, or perhaps she'd just gotten better at performing. She claimed I'd turned against her without reason, that she'd tried to maintain a relationship but I'd rejected her overtures. She admitted to Craig, said she'd made a mistake, that grief made people do irrational things, that she'd sought comfort in the wrong place. She framed it as a brief lapse in judgment during an impossibly difficult time. Never mentioned that the affair had lasted 2 years. Never mentioned the messages about Nathan's death. Just a grieving widow who'd stumbled and was now being punished excessively by a vindictive mother-in-law. Her attorney asked about the reduced trust distributions. Diane testified that $3,000 monthly wasn't enough to live on, that she'd had to move to a small apartment, give up her car, cut back on everything, that it was humiliating and unnecessary, that her father had established the trust to provide for her comfort, and I was perverting its intent to satisfy my personal vendetta. When her attorney finished, the judge asked Stewart if he wanted to cross-examine. Stewart said he did. He started gently, asked Diane how long she'd been married to Nathan. 6 years, she answered. Asked when the affair with Craig had begun. She hesitated, then admitted it had been about 2 years. Stewart let that sink in. A 2-year affair wasn't a brief lapse in grief. It was an ongoing betrayal during the marriage. Then Stewart began introducing evidence, the photos, the financial records showing expensive spending on Craig, the social media posts, each piece documented, verified, undeniable. Diane's composure started cracking. She tried to explain each item away, but there were too many. The pattern was too clear. Then Stewart brought out the messages. The texts between Diane and Craig discussing Nathan's death, talking about waiting for the age gap to take care of things, speculating about accidents. Diane went pale. She stammered that those were just words, meaningless venting, that people say things they don't mean when they're unhappy. Stewart asked if Nathan had known about the affair. Diane said no. Stewart produced the investigator's report, showed that Nathan had hired a private investigator 6 months before his death, that Nathan had known everything. The courtroom was silent. Even Judge Morrison leaned forward, attention fully focused. Stewart asked Diane why Nathan would hire an investigator unless he had concerns about her fidelity and character. Diane had no answer. He asked why Nathan would change his will so dramatically unless he had serious reasons to protect his assets from his wife. Again, silence. Then Stewart called me to the stand. I walked up slowly, using my cane not because I needed it, but because I wanted the judge to see me as I was. 74 years old, physically ordinary, nothing special or impressive. Just a mother who'd lost her son. Stewart asked me about Nathan. I talked about him, about raising him alone after James died, about his integrity, his work ethic, his kindness, about how proud I'd been when he'd become an attorney, bought his house, built a life. Stewart asked how I'd felt when Diane moved Craig into Nathan's house 2 months after the funeral. I told the truth, devastated, betrayed, watching my son's memory be disrespected in the home he'd worked so hard to buy. Stewart asked about my qualifications to manage the trust. I told the judge I'd managed my family's finances for 50 years, raised a son on limited income, managed James's construction business books for a decade, handled my own investments after James died. I wasn't a professional, but I wasn't incompetent either. Then, Stewart asked the key question. Why had I reduced Diane's distributions? I looked directly at Judge Morrison, told her that the trust's terms required responsible behavior and moral conduct, that Diane's father had written those clauses deliberately to protect his daughter from her own poor choices, that, as trustee, I'd evaluated Diane's behavior of the affair, the cohabitation, the frivolous spending, the messages about Nathan's death, and determined she was violating the trust's fundamental principles. I told the judge that $3,000 monthly was sufficient for basic needs, that $15,000 had enabled a lifestyle of excess and poor judgment, that my role as trustee was to manage the trust according to its intent, not to make Diane comfortable in her bad decisions. Diane's attorney cross-examined me aggressively, tried to rattle me with questions about my age, my education, my lack of professional credentials, asked if I was really capable of making complex financial decisions at 74, suggested I was acting on emotion rather than reason. I let him finish. Then I answered calmly, told him that age meant experience, that 74 years of life had taught me to recognize character or the lack of it, that I'd watched Diane carefully for months before making any decisions, that everything I'd done was documented, justified, and within my legal authority as trustee. He tried again, asked if I felt any sympathy for Diane as a young widow. I told him I felt tremendous sympathy for young widows. My neighbor Mrs. Chen was a widow. Several women at my church were widows. They grieved appropriately. They honored their late husbands' memories. They didn't move lovers into their husbands' houses or spend their inheritances on affairs. Judge Morrison actually smiled slightly at that answer. Then Stewart introduced the final piece, the one I'd been holding in reserve. He called Stewart himself back to the stand, technically a procedural irregularity, but the judge allowed it. Stewart testified about Nathan's visits to his office in the months before his death, about Nathan's concerns, his fear that Diane was dangerous, his careful planning to protect his assets and his mother. And then Stewart revealed something we hadn't mentioned before, something that Nathan had told him in confidence, that Stewart had documented in his contemporaneous notes. That was now part of the legal record. Nathan had told Stewart he was planning to divorce Diane. He'd asked Stewart to begin preliminary work on divorce filings. He'd been waiting until after a major case settled so he could handle the process without professional complications. He'd told Stewart he'd been a fool to ignore the warning signs, that Diane had married him for financial security and stayed for access to his money and her trust fund. Nathan had known exactly who his wife was, and he'd been taking steps to protect himself when he died. The courtroom erupted. Diane's attorney objected, claimed hearsay, demanded the information be excluded. Judge Morrison overruled him. Stewart's contemporaneous notes were admissible as evidence of Nathan's state of mind and intent. They explained everything: why Nathan had changed his will, why he'd made me trustee, why he'd been so careful in his planning. My son had been preparing to leave Diane, and she'd known something was wrong. That's why the messages with Craig had escalated. That's why they'd talked about accelerating things. They'd sensed Nathan pulling away and panicked. Judge Morrison called for a recess, told both attorneys she needed time to review the evidence. We reconvened an hour later. The judge's ruling was decisive. She found that I was acting appropriately within my authority as trustee, that the evidence showed clear violations of the trust's moral conduct clauses, that reducing distributions was not only justified but arguably too lenient given Diane's behavior. Judge Morrison went further. She stated that Diane's petition appeared to be an attempt to escape accountability for her own choices, that the court would not reward infidelity, poor judgment, and disrespect for the deceased by overriding a properly executed trust administration. She denied Diane's petition entirely, upheld my trusteeship, and added one more thing. She ordered Diane to pay court costs and my legal fees for having to defend against a frivolous challenge. Diane's face went white. Her attorney looked shocked. The petition had been their Hail Mary attempt, and it had failed spectacularly. Judge Morrison looked at Diane directly, told her she was a young woman who'd been given significant financial resources through no effort of her own, that her father had tried to protect her with trust terms she'd violated, that her husband had died in tragic circumstances, and rather than honoring his memory, she'd dishonored it immediately and publicly. The judge told Diane she should be grateful for the $3,000 monthly she was still receiving, that many people lived on far less, that she should reflect on her choices and the consequences they'd brought. Then Judge Morrison dismissed the case. I sat in the courtroom after everyone left. Just for a moment. Stewart was gathering papers, talking to Robert about next steps. I looked at the empty judge's bench and thought about Nathan. He'd protected me perfectly. Even beyond the grave, my son had given me everything I needed to win: the will, the evidence, the trusteeship, and finally, through Stewart's testimony, the confirmation that he'd known, that he'd seen Diane clearly and taken steps to save himself and protect me. Outside the courthouse, Diane walked past us without a word. Her face was set, hard. She'd lost completely. No money, no house, no sympathy, no way forward except accepting that for the next decade or more, she'd live on a fraction of what she'd expected, reminded monthly of her mistakes. Stewart asked how I felt. I told him I felt like I could finally breathe. For 8 months, I'd carried this weight, planning, watching, waiting, playing a role. Now it was finished. At 74 years old, I'd fought the most important battle of my life. And I'd won. Not just for me, but for Nathan, for his memory, for justice. My son had trusted me with his final act of protection. and I'd honored that trust completely. 6 months have passed since the courthouse. 6 months since Judge Morrison's ruling. 6 months of living with the knowledge that I did exactly what my son needed me to do. I'm 74 years old now, still always. Somehow that number surprises me when I say it out loud. In my mind, I'm still 40, still 50. But my mirror tells a different story, and so do my joints on cold mornings. Time has a way of moving forward whether we're ready or not. The house in Boulder sold last month. I couldn't keep it, too many memories, and not all of them good anymore. A young couple bought it, expecting their first child. When they walked through during the showing, I watched them envision their future there. Nursery in the spare bedroom, family dinners in Nathan's kitchen. A life built on hope rather than betrayal. I used part of the proceeds to establish a scholarship fund in Nathan's name at his law school, for students from modest backgrounds, the ones who worked 2 jobs and carried the weight of being first-generation college graduates, the ones Nathan had been, the ones who understand that everything you build yourself, and nobody hands you anything. The Aspen house I kept, at least for now. I've been there twice since Nathan died. Both times I sat on the deck he loved, looking at mountains he'd shown me with such pride, and I talked to him, told him about Diane, about the hearing, about how I'd used everything he'd given me to protect his legacy. I like to think he heard me, that wherever he is, he knows his mother fought for him the way he'd fought for me his whole life. The trust continues exactly as established. Every month, the distribution processes $3,000 to Diane's account. Every month, a reminder. Stuart handles the administration, not the paperwork, the documentation, the formal trustee duties, but the decisions remain mine until the day I die. I've heard through Mrs. Chen that Diane moved out of state, Arizona, I think, trying to start over somewhere. Nobody knows her story. Craig left long ago, of course. The moment the money dried up, so did his affection. Funny how that works. Monica doesn't call anymore, neither does Aunt Patricia. The people who'd testified on Diane's behalf, who'd accused me of being vindictive and unreasonable, disappeared after the judge's ruling. Fair-weather friends who chose the wrong side and didn't want to face the consequences of their own poor judgment. I don't miss them. At 74, I've learned that quality matters more than quantity. The friends who stayed, who understood what I was doing and why, they're the ones worth keeping. Mrs. Chen still comes by for tea every Thursday. We talk about our late husbands, our memories, the ways we've survived loss. She told me once that she was proud of how I'd handled everything. Coming from a woman who'd been widowed 30 years and raised 3 children alone, that meant something. Stuart retired last month, 40 years of practicing law, and he told me my case was one of the most satisfying conclusions of his career. Not because of the legal complexity, though, that was there, but because justice was served, because a good man's final wishes were honored, because an old woman proved that age doesn't mean powerless. We had lunch before he closed his practice. He told me something I hadn't known. Nathan had asked him, about a year before he died, to watch out for me if anything ever happened. Not legally, Nathan knew I could handle that, but personally, make sure I was okay, make sure I wasn't alone. Stuart said he'd promised, and then, when Nathan died and Stuart saw the will, saw what Nathan had set up, he understood. My son hadn't just been protecting his assets, he'd been protecting me, giving me purpose, giving me a mission that would keep me sharp, engaged, alive. Grief can kill you when you're my age. Not dramatically, not immediately, but slowly. You lose your spouse, then your child, and suddenly you're just waiting, existing rather than living. Nathan knew that, so he'd given me something to fight for. A reason to be strategic, careful, strong, and in fighting for him, I'd saved myself. I think about that sometimes, late at night in my small condo. How Nathan's last gift wasn't the money or the property, or even the justice against Diane. It was giving me back my purpose, reminding me that at 74, I still mattered, still had power, still had the wisdom that only decades of living can provide. The younger generation forgets that sometimes. They see gray hair and assume they see wrinkles and think confusion. They see 74 and expect submission. Diane learned the hard way that those assumptions are dangerous. But this story isn't really about Diane. It's about mothers and sons, about the bonds that death can't break, about trust that extends beyond the grave. Nathan knew me better than anyone, knew I'd fight for him, knew I had the strength to do what needed doing. And I did. I've started volunteering at a senior center downtown, teaching financial literacy classes to other elderly folks, especially women who never handled money because their husbands did it all. I teach them what I learned over 74 years: how to read bank statements, understand investments, recognize when someone's trying to take advantage, how to protect themselves. Last week, a woman named Dorothy came up after class. She was 81, recently widowed, and her son-in-law was pressuring her to sign over power of attorney. Something about it felt wrong to her, but she didn't know what to do. I spent an hour with her, reviewing the documents, explaining her rights, helped her find an attorney who could advise her independently. She reminded me that there are Dianes everywhere, people who see vulnerability and think opportunity. But there are also Virginia's women who've lived long enough to recognize predators, smart enough to protect themselves and others. Every class I teach, I think about Nathan, about how he'd be proud that I'm using what he taught me to help others, about how his legacy isn't just a scholarship fund or a trust administration, but the knowledge that defending yourself and those you love is possible at any age. My doctor tells me I'm in good health for 74. My mother lived to 89. Her mother made it to 92. Longevity runs in my family, which means I might have 15, even 20 years left as Diane's trustee. 15 to 20 years of monthly reminders that underestimating someone because of age is the most expensive lesson she'll ever learn. Sometimes I wonder if she thinks about me. If every month when that distribution hits her account, she remembers the old woman she dismissed, the confused widow she thought she could manage. I wonder if she's learned anything, grown at all, understood the consequences of her choices. Probably not. Some people never learn. But that's not my concern anymore. I did what Nathan needed me to do. Diane's future, what she makes of it, what she learns or doesn't learn, that's on her now. As for me, I'm living, really living, not just existing. I take art classes at the community college. Started painting last spring, terrible at it. But I enjoy it. I have dinner with friends, visit the Aspen House occasionally, manage the trust with Stuart's former partner, who took over his cases. Stay sharp, stay engaged. At 74, I discovered something about myself I hadn't known. I'm stronger than I thought, smarter than people assume, more capable than age suggests. Nathan knew that he'd known it all along, and in trusting me with his final act of justice, he gave me the chance to prove it to myself. If this story touched you, if you've ever been underestimated because of your age, or loved someone who was taken too soon, or fought for justice when everyone said you should just let it go, I want to hear from you. Drop your city in the comments below. Let me know where you're watching from, what your story is, because every one of us has a story. Every grandmother, every widow, every person society tries to push aside because they've counted too many birthdays. Our stories matter. Our experiences matter. The wisdom that comes from 74 years of living, or 84, or 64, it matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, subscribe to this channel. Because I've learned over these 74 years that the most powerful stories are the ones we're told we're too old, too weak, too irrelevant to tell. My son trusted me with his story, with his justice, with his legacy, and I honored that trust with everything I had, not because I was young or strong or powerful in the traditional sense, but because I was his mother, because I'd lived long enough to know exactly what needed to be done, because age isn't weakness. It's armor forged over decades of battles survived and lessons learned. Nathan protected me even in death, and I, at 74 years old, proved that a mother's love and an old woman's wisdom are forces that no amount of beauty, youth, or manipulation can overcome. That's my story. That's my son's legacy. And that's the truth I'll carry with me for however many years I have left, that we're never too old to fight for what matters, never too old to demand justice. Never too old to prove that underestimating us is the biggest mistake anyone can make. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, age is just a number. Wisdom is forever.